For the first week, we're going to be looking at the ways in which the European settlers came to North America and began to interact with it, and the massive changes that come from the initial encounters that they have with Native Americans and others. So to start with, right, this is a history of the United States, and this is a history of what will become the United States from its first encounters with Europeans in the 1400s, 1500s, and then moving through to the end of the American Civil War and the election of 1876. Now, we will briefly talk about the Native American civilizations and nations and that lived here in what becomes the United States and all of North America. And we'll talk about them first in the very beginning of the class. But then we will also encounter them, Native Americans, many times throughout the course, and we will be discussing the interactions that the United States has with the United States governments have with the different Native American tribes, and obviously there are some names there that you'll remember, right? The Trail of Tears. You'll remember other instances as well. But we'll also talk about the sort of frontier engagements that occur throughout this period. So let us then begin the course. So when we look at the sort of European arrivals that come to the New World in North America after 1492, right, one of the big things to understand is that there are different types of empire, right? When we look at empires in the previous iterations, right, when we look at things like the Ottoman Empire in what becomes the Middle East, if you look at things like the Roman Empire going back to classical antiquity, these are empires that spread out from a single location, right? So in the example of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks start here in what is Anatolia, today's Turkey, and then spread out, conquering other places. That's different here in North America, right? There's the discovery of this area. There's a massive death that comes along with that. And we'll talk about this in a second. But the push, right, there are things called push and pull factors when we discuss immigration and migration, and that is certainly true here. The things that push Europeans across the Atlantic is largely economic, right? And we know that there are some names that I'm sure you have all encountered at some point in the past. But you have discoverers, right? People who discover, quote unquote, the New World, right? And that starts with the two pictures I have on the screen currently, right? The top picture is Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, who establishes a school at Sagres in southern Portugal, which trains young sailors to go across the Atlantic, or I should say, young sailors to travel and discover new territories. And we know that there are different sailors. Vasco da Gama, who goes around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. You have Pedro Cabral, who ultimately winds up in Brazil in the 1500s. The most famous, obviously, I think, is Isabella and Ferdinand, right? King and queen of the Spanish kingdoms in the late 1400s. And Christopher Columbus, right, the Genoese northern Italian sailor, approaches Ferdinand and Isabella and asks them to send forth an expedition to try and go across the Atlantic, right? And then when we were kids, we were all told that Columbus was crazy because he thought the world was flat. And that is actually not true, right? For thousands of years, or at least hundreds of years, people had known the world was round. At least educated people had known the world was a sphere. And they were not considering that him crazy for that. What they thought he was crazy about was the miscalculation. He thought it was much small. The globe was much smaller than it actually is. And we have these first encounters, right? Now, what would push the Europeans to sail? What are those motivations, right? And we have some examples of that. So this is a document, and forgive all the mistypes, right? This is a untranslated, as you would see, right? Untranslated piece of literature from the period, right? So there's a lot of just funny words. But one of the things that's motivating them is religion. So this is Richard Hakluyt, who is an English sailor who comes to North America in the 1500s, and is there to try and encourage people to sail, right, to go across. And he says here, right, that this Western discovery, right, so the North America and the Americas, will be greatly for the enlargement of the gospel of Christ unto the princes of the Reformed religion, and chiefly bound amongst who Her Majesty is principal, right? The idea here is it's all about religion. It's about expanding Christianity. Now, once the Europeans arrive, right, once we think about the movement, right, we talk about the 3 G's: God, gold, and glory. So for God, right, that document that I just showed you, again, a little later than what I was just talking about, is there to show you that, right, it's about religion. It's about Christianity. It's about trying to expand Christian religion. Gold obviously means riches, and glory means sort of your name going down in history. And that's what motivates all these people. Now, for the Native Americans, right, this has devastating impacts. Why? If you look at the chart that I've posted that is here, you can see that when the Europeans sail across to the Americas, they bring some important stuff, right? They bring cattle, sheep, pigs, horses. These had never been known in North America or South America before. And this changes transportation, food, diets. It changes everything about what people wear. All of this changes, right? But it also brings other foods, right? Wheat and barley, some fruits and vegetables. But really the most devastating impact is disease. There are massive amounts of illnesses that travel across the Atlantic with the Europeans. They're invisible travelers, right? And when the Europeans come to North America, they transfer these illnesses without even knowing it. So Native Americans start dying in the hundreds of thousands, so that by about, if we go from 1492 and Columbus's first encounter with Native Americans to the early 1600s, something between 80 and 90% of the Native American population has passed away. And that is obviously devastating, right? That wipes out traditions, cultures, languages. But it also creates a situation where Europeans can really rewrite North and South America. And we know that, right? Again, all of the history that you probably learned in elementary school, junior high, maybe even high school, is built around that narrative, right? That the Europeans come to North and South America and change the society. Now, that's going across the Atlantic and the devastating impacts there. Going from North America to Europe, Africa, and Asia are other products. Things such as, again, nothing super important, right? Tomatoes, right? Of course, we know, think about Italy when we think about tomatoes. Turkey, right? Turkey is not huge in Europe or Africa or Asia. But the products that are extremely important are things like potatoes and corn. Or even, well, obviously tobacco, the addictive properties there. But things like potato and corn are extremely important to European diets. And more importantly, to the survival of Europeans, right? These new crops, again, particularly things like sweet potato, corn, peppers, increase life expectancy because potatoes and corn in particular can grow in obviously terrible soil, right? We all know about the Irish and the Irish potato famine. Ireland does not have great soil. So the increased caloric intake from things like potato and corn actually mean there's a population boom, right? So in North and South America, the population plummets because of disease. But in Africa, Europe, and Asia, the populations actually start to rise because of more caloric foods that can grow in really almost any environment. So, North South America, population decreases. North South America, population decreases. Europe, Africa, Asia, population increases. Because of the massive amounts of death that occur in North and South America, there's a need for a labor force. And that's where African slaves are presented as a labor source. And obviously there are racial reasons why Africans are chosen, but there's also obviously labor reasons. 1619, the first slaves arrive in Jamestown, Virginia, but slaves had been imported into South America earlier than that, right? As early as the 1530s, there start to be importation of slaves into South America. So this is something that is occurring here. Finally, the sort of last thing I want to touch on here is the social impact. So one of the things that's important here is that in European societies that come to North and South America, some of them come and recreate their own, what they knew in Europe. So for the Europeans, right, the Spanish in particular, they come and they establish a social system that is very much hierarchical, starting with Peninsulares, right? The Peninsulares are groups of people who are born in Spain and come here to North America or South America, and they are going to hold the highest positions, your governors, your viceroys, etc. The Creoles or Criollos were the class below them, usually the children of, right? So they are the children of the Peninsulares. They are the children of the people born in Spain, and they held the second highest groups classes, right? They might be customs officials. They might be merchants. They hold really good paying jobs, but not the highest jobs. And then down the line, you have mestizos and mulattos, mixed races of European, typically European father, and native or slave mother. And then finally, you have the Zombo class, which is the Native American or the African descended peoples. That doesn't. So the other piece, and let me just say on Spanish America for a second, right? The other piece about Spanish America is a heavy importation of Catholicism. Spain was a Christian and, more importantly, a Catholic empire. So the Catholic Church had massive domination throughout the South American Spanish colonies, and so much so that there are churches established, schools are established in this period. However, when we look at Britain doesn't have that in particular, right? So not many women are being brought to North American colonies that are British. So by the late 1600s, there's something like 1 in 6, so 1 woman for every 6 men are coming over, and typically those women would be the family members of the governors or the family members of the upper classes. But along with this, right, there's not a lot of social structure. There's not a lot of what is experienced in the Spanish colonies. And it's really, there's a lot of men, mostly men being brought over because it's all about extraction, right? Grow tobacco, or try and find gold, or, not really so much about assimilation. When the Europeans arrive in the 1500s, primarily it's the Spanish who arrive first, right? And the Spanish conquer the Caribbean and then into northern South America. And as we talked about a moment ago, right, the initial social divisions that are established are really based on sort of Spanish, or I should say European-born individuals, and then after that, right, there's many different divisions that arise. But for the most part, it's really important to understand, right, that the Spanish, they're first, and they are establishing really a total conquest, right? By the 1540s, native empires such as the Aztec and the Incas have been defeated, and there are viceroys, right, established, right? So there are 4 primary viceroys established. You have New Spain, which is here in what is today Mexico, and going into parts of the southern United States. You have New Granada. You have the Rio de la Plata in southern in southern South America, and then you have around Quito in Ecuador. So these viceroys are really just sort of outposts from Madrid, right? They are outposts where the royal governor has almost unilateral control. You can see also that by about the 1650s, right, the control of what would become the United States is very, very small, right? We're talking about really tiny little outposts in the middle of really just, sort of a vast unknown territory, at least to the Europeans, right? For Native Americans, right, this had been their territory for thousands of years. But for the Europeans, as the Native Americans are dying off, Europeans are able to consolidate control, at least around the eastern seaboard. And we know very well, right, that the first colonies were established by the British in places like Jamestown, what would become Virginia. You also have Massachusetts, right, in the 1620s with initially the Pilgrims, right, and then the Dutch in what would become New York, New Amsterdam into New York. And then the French are up here in what would become France. Become Canada, but it's called New France at the time. However, within the next 100 years or so, right, the European claims to North America and South America expand, right, so that the Spanish move their territory into northern parts of what would become the United States, right? You have what will be known as the Louisiana Territory in Texas. You have changes within the Caribbean, and then England and France have expanded their control as well, right? So you have the original 13 colonies, and then the British expand their control, the English expand their control into more parts of Canada, and so on. So let's talk about the first 13 colonies, right? Since this is a U.S. history course, it's important for us to see sort of what makes these colonies tick, right? Now there are 3 different types of colonies that could exist under the English model. The first was a corporate colony established by a corporation, given a charter through the royal government in London. And these would be run by joint stock companies, right? So you have the Virginia Company that establishes Jamestown, right? And the goal for the Virginia Company is to make as much money as possible for its stockholders, right? For its shareholders, right? So the goal there is to produce as much tobacco as possible, bring it back to England, sell it for as much as possible, and capitalize on that. Now, these corporate colonies, again, they're very much business oriented. They exist through the grant of the king, but there's not much governing going on by the government, right? They're sort of self-controlled institutions, right? They may establish governments, right? So we know that in Virginia, at least, they established the House of Burgesses. And they establish a government where at least they can sort of self-regulate themselves. There are other types of colonies, though, that do exist, right? There are royal colonies. This is more true for a place like the Carolinas, where there's a specific control being done through and by the king's representatives, so that the king would establish a governor who would have policies that they would enact. And again, all power comes through the king, and all decisions are made with the king's goals in mind. The final form of colony is what are called proprietary colonies. So these are gifts given by the king to specific individuals, right? So we've all, I'm sure, have heard of William Penn of Pennsylvania's fame. And that is a gift given to William Penn and his family and all of his successors down the line up until about the 1800s. There is a Penn family member in charge of the colony, and even once it becomes a state of Pennsylvania. So proprietary colonies are really gifts to friends, to colleagues of the king, who then controls a certain piece of territory. Now, these three colonies, when we think about the 13 colonies, we talk about them in sort of one voice, right? But it's important for us to remember that certainly for themselves, they would not have seen themselves as sort of one unit. They would have seen themselves as 13 distinct colonies. They would have traded, obviously, back and forth with one another, but they were not a cohesive group. And that's one of the things that obviously comes out of the American Revolution, or at least the lead up to the Revolution. So these colonies have different relationships with each other, with the crown, and creates a lot of different environments. So the first English establishment comes in 1585 at the colony of Roanoke. Now, Roanoke is one of those sort of historical anomalies where a whole bunch of groups, a whole bunch of people arrive at the colony in far eastern Virginia seaboard, and they wind up disappearing. And no one knows what happens to them. No one knows where they go, but they completely disappear. Now, it takes a while to establish a new colony, right? So it takes about 22 years until the early 1600s when Jamestown is established as an English colony. Moving further up the seaboard, right, you have New Amsterdam. So on the southern tip of what becomes Manhattan Island, you have the first Dutch toehold in North America. And what's really important to know there is not necessarily that it's Dutch and that it establishes a Dutch toehold, right? But the really important piece is that as part of a larger war in the 1640s, you have beginning skirmishes within the colony itself. And when that occurs, you start to have cracks within the social environment, right? But it's important to know that Manhattan Island, at least initially, was very much a very diverse region, right? Because the Dutch did not have did not establish slavery in Manhattan. There were a lot of African Americans. There were a lot of different religious groups, different European groups, all living within this Dutch New Amsterdam colony. And the reason was, again, it's all about making profit. In the 1660s, the colony is taken over by the English, and when that occurs, right, there's a lot of transition that goes on, right, because the English have different policies than the Dutch had, different goals than the Dutch had, and that changes, once again, the nature of the colony. What's important for us to note here is that we think about the 13 colonies as homogenous, as sort of one group, but they are very different in their nature. The last group that we're going to talk about here is New France, right? So New France is established as a colony in and around what is known as the St. Lawrence River, the sort of natural river boundary between the United States and Canada. And the St. Lawrence River, the St. Lawrence River runs past Montreal and Quebec, and that they help establish those cities in Canada. But for New France, right, New France is a territory where there is a lot of intermarrying and a lot of dependency on Native Americans. So one of the things that's important to understand is very much just like in South America, where there's a lot of intermarriage and interconnection between the Europeans and the Native American population. The same exists in France, in the New French territories in Canada. One other thing to notice here is that unlike the agricultural nature of, let's say, Virginia, even Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, and South America, in New France, the real goal was beaver farm, and they kill off millions of beavers, so much so that it's almost to the point of extinction. And the Europeans need Native American assistance. The French need Native American assistance to attract and capture and trap these beavers. So there's a lot of interconnection, blending of French and Native American groups. The French, again, also being Catholic and wanting to convert Native Americans, they bring over a lot of priests, and there's a lot of conversion, or at least forced conversion, that goes on among the French and the Native Americans. So what we can see here, right, in the first two chapters is massive importation of really life-altering things, right? There's the food that goes across the Atlantic, the diseases that go crossing the Atlantic cause massive death, but also population growth. You have religion and cultural ideas. You have social ideas, all going back and forth across the Atlantic. And as the Europeans establish their toeholds here, right, one of the things that gives them that ability is the really complete annihilation of Native American civilizations, right? Native Americans, again, die off in between 80 to 90% of the population. And because of that, and because of the political impacts, the social impacts, the cultural impacts of that, there's going to be a lot of room for the Europeans to push themselves into greater control, right? Because if there's so many people dying, there's less people to cultivate and harvest food, which means more people are sick and more people are dying, which leads to, right, it becomes this positive feedback or negative feedback loop, if you want to kind of say that, right? So all that is creating a situation in which the Europeans can easily control North and South America, and we know establish colonies that will ultimately become the United States.